Meanwhile, former Vice President Mike Pence says he plans to fight a subpoena from the special counsel investigating former President Donald Trump's actions during the January 6th Capitol insurrection, calling the demand for his cooperation, quote, unprecedented and unconstitutional. So, Vaughn, you spoke with the former vice president in Iowa yesterday. I guess he doesn't want to speak on the record in a subpoena. I guess maybe in a legal setting makes him uncomfortable. But I'm sure he shared with you his insights to the Capitol insurrection, the day on January 6th, where there was an attempted coup, an attack on our democracy, where people were killed, where people now have gone to jail for years and years and years, and some have been charged in a historic move with seditious conspiracy. And of course, Mike Pence and his own family's life was threatened as well. I'm sure he had some insights to share with you about that.
And all of this is happening as he's considering running for president himself against Donald Trump.
Of course he would have insights for you about this momentous day.
Well, we thought that maybe Mike Pence, as part of a potential presidential run, would try to draw a contrast on how he handled the aftermath of the 2020 election with Donald Trump. He did write extensively in his book about those weeks leading up to it, about January 6th. He's talked about it. He's done interviews. Yet he clearly wants to move away from it. And by not complying with the subpoena, whether it's Donald Trump arguing that executive privilege precludes their conversations from going before the Department of Justice, or his argument that that day he was serving in the legislative body as Senate president, the courts are going to determine whether he's got to comply with it or not. But that's why yesterday I wanted to put the question to him, more of the existential question of the subpoena does not preclude him from voluntarily going to the Department of Justice. If this day was such a significant moment in American history, like he has suggested, then why not go and talk about his experience in his conversations with Donald Trump? Take a listen.
I think the issue here is whether or not a vice president who served as president of the Senate should be subject to a subpoena to appear in court.
But would you voluntarily?
The Justice Department has insisted. The Justice Department has insisted on that and on reserving that right in the event this were a matter that would go to trial. And we just simply made it clear to them we think it is not only unprecedented, but it's unconstitutional. And so we'll.
Would you be open to voluntarily?
But I will tell you, look, as I've said, I've written extensively about this. I've spoken extensively.
It's different than going under oath.
Well, no, the Justice Department has been involved in an extensive fact-finding effort. And in my judgment, this principle of separation of powers is that important.
Well, it's actually, this is not about separation of powers. There's just not a judge that's going to say that Mike Pence acting in the ceremonial position is able to use this as a way to not answer the subpoena and testify. So I'm wondering what Vaughn, did you get any background from people close to Mike Pence on what he's trying to do? Is this a political play? Because it's not a good legal play. So is it a political play? Is he trying not to offend Trump anymore? What have you gotten from people close to Pence?
Mike Pence is, every single time that he describes the Department of Justice, he's describing it as a political one, an arm of the Joe Biden administration here. And when you talk to Republicans, voters on the ground, including some that I talked to yesterday, they are hell-bent on the belief that there is a underground Democratic effort to undermine not just Donald Trump, but the Republican Party. And that's where Mike Pence, if he is going to run for president of the United States, has to find that balance. And clearly there is a Republican electorate that believes in this idea of the deep state that undermined Donald Trump. A large number of Republican voters still think the election was stolen from him. And so that's where Mike Pence, we're talking about more than 2 years since leaving Washington, D.C., is still battling this. And I was talking to Republicans at that very event that came out to see Mike Pence. Now, he intended to talk about a school district that put in a gender-affirming care policy. That was the social issue that he wanted to talk at that campaign event about. But I was talking talking about this woman, Michelle, a Republican Iowa voter, and I said, who's your top choice for the caucus 1 year from now? And she goes, well, Donald Trump. I go, but what about Mike Pence? Like, he's literally here, and you just came to see him. She goes, yeah, I like him. I like what he's saying, but Donald Trump is still my number one choice. And that is what Mike Pence is up against, as much as he would like to talk about every other issue but January 6th in the effort to overturn the democracy. Donald Trump, just like he's got Nikki Haley by the wrist, he's also got Mike Pence by the wrist. And each of these candidates are going to have to continue to answer these questions, whether they like it or not.
Well, new reporting. Sorry, Joe.
I was just going to say, Jonathan Lemire. Jonathan, you of course reported on January 6th, wrote a book on January the 6th. We have all of these people involved in January the 6th, and even some politicians that weren't involved in January 6th who spoke after January the 6th that were just downright critical of Donald Trump. And now they're politically schizophrenic. You have Mike Pence, obviously, who was very critical of what Donald Trump wanted him to do. He showed backbone on January the 6th, and I'm grateful for it that he did. But now he's showing absolutely no courage whatsoever and trying to run from it. Kevin McCarthy, of course, on the floor, blasted Donald Trump, told other people in his caucus that he was screaming and shouting and swearing at Donald Trump on January the 6th. Then he backs away from it and now doesn't want to cross him. You can look at Nikki Haley, of course, who said in 2016, here's a guy who supported, wouldn't criticize the Klan. There's no way I could ever support him. And then, of course, what she said after January the 6th. I mean, she's flip-flopping back and forth time and again. You even look at Lindsey Graham, who had some of the harshest criticisms of Donald Trump in 2016. All of these people are politically schizophrenic. They're trying to play both sides, and in trying to play both sides, they only strengthen Donald Trump's hand.
Yeah, the only Republicans who have been consistent and stayed with their criticism of Trump and January 6th, it's a very short list. It's Liz Cheney, Mitt Romney, a couple others, and that's about it. Even someone like Mitch McConnell, as we've been talking about, has said he would support Trump again were he to be the GOP nominee in 2024. And Vaughn, the Pence part of this is the politics of it. We look, this is a right and a wrong about whether or not he should be testifying. But what's the political play here? Because if you're Pence, you're so closely associated with Trump, and you're clearly trying not to criticize him too much. You don't want to be seen as cooperating with January 6th in the deep state. But at the same time, do the Pence people not understand that Trump's diehard supporters will never forgive him for standing up to Trump in January 6th? Who's actually going to vote for him?
I think that's the question that we're going to be continuing to ask over the next 11 months, because, it's when you're talking about Mike Pence in his book, he outlines that leaving the Oval Office one day just before January 6th, he turned to the then president and said, outside of your family, there has been no one more loyal to you than me, Vice President Mike Pence. And I think anybody in this country could agree. We went, when I was on foreign trips with him around the country, he there continually said, I am here for President Trump. I am speaking for President Trump. President Trump has done this. He has done that. Mm-hmm. And despite all of that, that moment, that election, completely for so many voters, has made him null to this process here. And that is the issue, because for the 4 years of success that the Trump administration would like to tout, that Mike Pence would like to tout, there is such a large subsection of the Republican electorate that believes they should have had 4 more years. And you know who got in the way of that? Yep. One man. It was Mike Pence. Down in Georgia, Fulton County, there are 18 targets of that investigation, right? You could say that if you're a Republican, that there are 18 individuals that were looking to do their part in Georgia to make Donald Trump make sure that he served another 4 years. Ultimately, who got in the way of this process? It's Mike Pence, and that is unforgivable for so many Republican voters.
My God.
Well, but Mika, as Jonathan just said, though, those Trump supporters are never going to support Mike Pence.
Never.
And so if you're trying to have it both ways, you're going to lose. There's a large chunk of the electorate, even the Republican electorate, maybe 45, 50% of the electorate that don't want Donald Trump to be their nominee. That's what Mike Pence and others should go after. And Vaughn just talked about Georgia. I can't think of a better example of Brad Raffensperger, and the governor down there, who both, his name escapes him now, who's the Georgia governor? Brian Kemp. Both of them crossed Donald Trump in a hard, tough way. Both of them did.
In real time.
And we heard reports that they were done. Brad Raffensperger's never going to win. Kemp, the Trumpers are going to overwhelm him. They crushed Donald Trump. They crushed Donald Trump in the Deep South, in a really conservative state for Republicans. That's the pathway forward. You do it the way Brian Kemp did it. You did it the way Brad Raffensperger said. The election wasn't stolen. Come on, y'all. Stop. Just stop. We want to win future elections. Stop lying about past. They can do it. And if you're saying, oh, you can't do it or you'll end up like Liz Cheney, why don't you talk to Brad Raffensperger or talk to Brian Kemp? They did it, and they had massive landslide victories in Georgia Republican primaries.